Species. Unite.
My colleague and I went out to Arizona because there was a community that was concerned about the expansion of an egg-laying operation, essentially in their backyard. At full capacity, that operation was slated to house 12 million birds. 12 million birds. It's like New York City, but with chickens.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you like today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. We know that what we eat has an enormous impact on billions of animals, on our health, and the health of the planet. If we fail to change our diets and the food system, the planet will face increasingly severe environmental, social, and economic consequences, many of which we are already beginning to see. We know this. We know that there is much more we could be doing about it on large and small scales. Yet the urgency just isn't there. And I think the more knowledge that we have, the more we are willing to demand change and even change ourselves. So I wanted to go deeper into the food system to get a better understanding of its impact on public health, the planet, ecosystems, and social justice, and mostly to hear about how we actually change it. This episode marks the beginning of a special 4-part series with some of the experts from Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. And this conversation is with Brent Kim. Brent is a program officer for the center's Food Production and Public Health Program. His research spans issues from farm to fork. He has published works on sustainable diets, climate change, industrial food and animal production, food and agriculture policy, soil safety, and urban food systems. And he and I talk about much of it, how to change it, and solutions for a much better future. Hi, Brent.
Hi, Beth. Great to meet you. Hope you had a nice trip down to Baltimore.
I did.
So, would you like me to say a little bit about the Center for a Livable Future?
I would like that.
Happy to. So, we're an interdisciplinary center based out of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We work at the intersection of diet, food production, public health, the environment, and equity, which is a lot. We're covering a lot of bases here. But if I were to distill that down into a 5-second elevator pitch, we work on issues from farm to fork and beyond. If it involves people, animals, food, health, planet, we touch on it in some way. And we do that through a combination of research. So how can we leverage our expertise in one of the leading scientific institutions in the world to better understand these problems and make sure that we're moving toward the right solution. So that's the science piece of it. We also have a phenomenal communications team, because if we're just tucked away in the tower of academia and it never gets out into the world, like, we don't do science for the sake of science. We do science because we want to reach people with these messages. So that's the communications piece. And the third is, and this is really important, is we hope that we can inform policies, whether at the local, state, or federal level, with the best available science.
Let's take that apart a little bit to begin with, because it's such a kind of weird word these days, but sustainable. When you say, oh, we want to make sure it's sustainable, what does that mean?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because a lot of people think sustainable and they immediately think of the environment. They think clean air, clean water, climate change. And rightly they should, because that's a critical component of sustainability, right? Is ecological soundness is another word for it. Are we growing food and following dietary patterns that align with goals that will avoid the most catastrophic climate change scenario? So no doubt there's an environmental component of sustainability, And also, when we're talking about a sustainable diet, for example, which is a big focus of our research, it is not enough for a dietary pattern to be, quote unquote, like good for the environment. There's a lot, because you could have the most environmentally friendly diet, but it's not sustainable if, for example, people can't afford or if people don't have access to the foods that are being recommended in the diet. So that's the other piece. A sustainable diet is also one that people have physical access to the foods that are in that diet and also economic access. They can afford it. It is also a dietary pattern that is socially just. A sustainable diet is also one that is nutritionally viable, and that's critically important.
Let's go back and let's talk about climate. And there's a lot there as well. But with our industrial food system, will you talk about like what the food system's role is in climate change in terms of what it's doing and what needs to be fixed? Like all of it.
Yes, sure. In 2 minutes, go.
And go.
Yeah. I love Wendell Berry, farmer, author, and poet. Amazing writer. I also love dogs, and he's written some beautiful pieces on dogs. That's an aside, but he famously said that how we eat determines to a considerable extent how the world is used. I think that's a beautiful encapsulation of one half of the relationship between food and climate. What we're eating is, for better and for worse, a major driver of the climate crisis. But it's also a two-way relationship, because the climate crisis has profound impacts on what we can eat, what future generations will be able to eat, will be able to afford to eat, and even, and this is some of the leading research that we're doing right now, the climate crisis even has implications for not only the nutritional properties of the food that people eat, right? Higher CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and higher temperature can in some cases reduce the nutrient density of some very important staple crops. And not only that, this is something we're looking at, there are ways in which higher CO2 concentrations and higher temperatures can actually increase the uptake of some harmful chemicals into crops like rice, which are widely consumed by billions of people. And arsenic is a known carcinogen. So, what does the climate crisis mean for cancer risk for these billions of people who are relying on rice as their staple crop? Again, that's just one of a million examples we can dive in. So it's a two-way street, right? What we're eating is impacting the climate crisis, and the climate crisis is impacting the food that we eat.
Let's go to beef for a second, just so people get a big picture how beef production is causing so many problems for the climate.
Mm-hmm. So I think if your listeners, if there's nothing else they take away from this conversation, it would be this nugget, which is that global leaders and scientists have agreed that we have to limit global average temperature rise relative to the pre-industrial era, so like compared to the mid-1800s, say, right? We don't want global temperatures to rise more than 2 degrees Celsius relative to what they were. Ideally, we'd cap them at 1.5. How are we doing? Not great, right? You can see it on your face, right? We all know we're not doing well, right?
Yeah.
We've already exceeded 1 degree of warming, right? The limit is ideally 1.5. Here's the rub. A whole host of scientific studies have found that if we don't urgently reduce agriculture's contributions to climate change, we will almost certainly fail to stay below those targets. And here's a specific example from a specific study by Ivanovich et al. They found that by the end of the century, the food system alone is projected to add an additional 0.9 degrees of warming. Just the food system, just food and ag. We're not talking about fossil fuels, aren't even in the mix yet. If we did everything else perfectly with our energy grid, if we stop flying and everything's completely decarbonized, which I hope we do, but even if we did that, our food and agricultural system would still contribute an additional 0.7 to 0.9 degrees of warming. We're already above 1. So if you add on another 0.9, we're above 2, and we haven't even accounted for anything else yet. And it gets worse. So 2 additional points from that study. One, the vast majority, the largest share of warming in that study was from animal foods and ruminant meat. Animals with multiple stomachs, so cows and goats, mostly cows, were the largest contributor to that warming. And sobering still was that in that study, in that analysis, the authors assumed that per person, animal product intake remains the same. That analysis did not account for the fact that animal product intake is projected to rise on the order of 70%, particularly in low and middle income countries. The only reason why we saw so much warming in that study is because there would be more people. So to distill that down, key point being, our dietary patterns are setting us up to far exceed those climate mitigation targets. And that's even in the best case scenario in which nobody actually increases their animal product intake, whereas people actually are projected to increase their animal product intake.
And they're going to increase it a lot. I mean, people know we need to decrease, but there's not a lot of big movement in decreasing. But there's a lot of talk about solutions for cows, things like seaweed, feeding cows seaweed so they don't produce as much methane. Is that actually something that would make a big dent?
Yeah, so a lot of things to talk about there, because we're seeing labels now that say climate-friendly beef, and that's wholly misleading. In defense of beef, there are important roles for grazing animals. Modest number, I think that's the key point. Modest numbers of grazing animals in a sustainable food system. There can be roles for them. I'm not, no one here is anti-beef. We're not demonizing or judging anyone's food choices here. And in defense of cows, they can, for example, they can graze on land that's too rocky or too hilly to grow crops. So there are reasons why they can convert something that people can't eat, which is grass, into something they can, which is meat. In contrast to chickens and pigs, which are almost exclusively reliant on us devoting a very large share of feed crop production to feed those animals, whereas cows, again, that's assuming that cows are grass finished, which, as we know, many are not. Right? We devote an enormous share of U.S. cropland is just to feed animals, not to feed people. So going back to seaweed, right? Thank you. Right. So there are a number of technological interventions that have the intention of reducing beef's climate impact. One of them is seaweed. Another one is anaerobic digesters. And I know more about anaerobic digesters than I know about seaweed. I guess there are a number of questions one has to ask. So with any of these technological mitigation solutions, they're only aimed at a small piece of the puzzle. So you have to look at where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. There's a very large share from ruminant eructation or cattle burps. So I'm aware of studies that can suggest that, feeding the animal seaweed may mitigate that piece of their emissions. But then you also have the emissions from the management of their manure. So animal manure, as it decomposes, is a major source of methane and nitrous oxide, two very potent greenhouse gases. Then you also have another slice of greenhouse gas emissions that are, growing the crops that become the feed crops for the animals, or even managing the pasture. And then you have deforestation, another major greenhouse gas emission source for livestock production, right? So that's predominantly in Latin America. It's not, most of the beef consumed in the U.S. is domestically produced, but we are starting to import more from places like Brazil, where clearing the Amazon for grazing land. People think, they're burning the Amazon for soy. Actually, the majority of the clearing of the Amazon is for grazing lands. And that's a major contributor to climate change because, right, we know trees are essentially carbon. So when we're clearing those trees, all that carbon is being released into the atmosphere. So I'm going off on a tangent here, but it's all connected, right? Because there are all of these different sources of greenhouse gas emissions that go into producing the meat and the dairy that ends up on our plate. There are some technological mitigation options that might address one or two pieces of that. I'm not saying, harm reduction is a good thing. On the other hand, you have to ask, okay, well, how much of the greenhouse gas emissions are actually being addressed by that intervention? And secondly, and this is a really important one, what are the potential downsides that could ensue from that intervention? So something that we're looking at as an example. So seaweed, my father was Korean. I've eaten a lot of seaweed in my life, so seaweed is near and dear to my heart. And also, many species of seaweed are also known to accumulate heavy metals. And we're doing some research on this. We don't have the answers yet, but when we're feeding large amounts of seaweed to cows, what does that mean in terms of the potential for elevated concentrations of metals, harmful metals, like arsenic or lead, that end up in the cow's milk? And that's especially concerning. This is specifically what we're looking at for something like infant formula, right? So again, I would never say, it's not as simple as saying, well, seaweed is a bad idea, but we do have to ask these questions.
Yeah.
What worries me is when we have these companies that are adopting one or two of these interventions that maybe only get at a small piece of pie, piece of the climate greenhouse gas emissions pie, and then they use that as a rationale to greenwash their product and say it's climate friendly.
Right. What about pigs and chickens when it comes to climate?
Yeah, so on a per gram of protein basis, they are less greenhouse gas intense in general. Right. They are generally less greenhouse gas intensive to produce per pound of food or per gram of protein produced compared to ruminant animals.
Right.
But still, on the order of magnitude more greenhouse gas intensive to raise than plant foods.
Right.
And also, and I know you're going to interview my colleagues about this, I always, when we're having conversations about climate change, you can never really fully extract climate change from the other issues: animal welfare, antimicrobial use, the impact on rural communities. But if we were to make decisions purely on a climate change basis, I would say poultry is an improvement over beef. But then, we call it systems thinking, right? We don't look at one problem in isolation. We have to consider climate change alongside antimicrobial use, impacts to rural communities, everything else that comes along with chicken production. Right, like chickens.
Touch on it a little bit, because I think there's a lot of people who are still unaware how big the effect is on some of these communities living really close to pig farms or poultry farms.
Yeah, right. So chickens outnumber us in the United States by 7-1, which is pretty wild. We kill 9 billion animals per year in the United States. United States alone for food, 9 billion. Most of them mostly chickens. And okay, so if they outnumber us by 7-1, where are they? Where are these animals? Like, these typical operations can easily have numbers in the millions in a single operation. These things are the size of airplane hangars. And we're not just talking about meat, we're talking about eggs too, right? So my colleague and I went out to Arizona because there was a community that was concerned about the expansion of an egg-laying operation, essentially in their backyard. At full capacity, that operation was slated to house 12 million birds. 12 million birds. It's like New York City, but with chickens. And
I thought 50,000 was an enormous place.
12 million birds. Yeah. And numbers, I believe the numbers are higher for laying hens because, you can stack them. Broilers, they're all on the ground. There's not that verticality. So the numbers are higher for laying hens. So they were concerned, what is this going to mean for them in terms of odors or water quality, right? Typically it's, depending on the species, the ways, when you have millions of animals, and pigs, right, you don't have millions of pigs, you might have pigs in the thousands, but they produce a lot more manure per animal. And pig manure in particular, if you ever smelled it, it's potent. When you have that many animals in one place, it's not just the animals, it's all of their waste. They're essentially standing in their own waste. And then in the case of pigs, it's flushed out through slats in the floor into these liquid storage. They're called lagoons. Sounds like lagoon. It sounds it's like a euphemism. It's a waste pit. And it was like chicken's waste is typically stored dry, but in this laying operation in Arizona, it was also liquid. And so you have that decomposing organic matter there, and all the odors and the hydrogen sulfide and the ammonia and all these different gases that are linked to different respiratory illnesses. From studies, we know that an estimated 1 in 4 workers in indoor facilities have some form of respiratory illness because they're inhaling dry dander, particulate matter, dust, all of those gases. You look at the fans on these things, they're like airplane hangars with these massive fans. It's all being blown downwind to these communities. So it's a social justice issue for the people who live near them and for the people who work in them. Those operations in Arizona were staffed exclusively by prison labor. You see that we saw them being bussed in. That's not the case everywhere. But what does that mean, right? If it's not prison labor, and if we look at slaughter, it's often undocumented workers.
Right.
So what does it mean about the conditions in these places when we are relying on the most vulnerable, disempowered people in our community to do that work? And then you talk to the families of the people, right, who worked. We interviewed a few of them, just not recorded or anything, just in conversation. And they tell a story. They would have to throw, as the birds became, again, it's all about the bottom line, right? As the birds, once they were no longer producing enough eggs, because they were sort of aging out of their most productive years, the family members told us they were throwing them live maceration into grinders, right? There's certainly an animal welfare piece there, the animal stuff, but also for the workers too. Yeah. Like, you can imagine what that would do to someone. The last thing I'll say was that, these egg production facilities were exporting their eggs to California. Now, for folks who are familiar, California had passed some laws that said we don't want to sell any eggs in our state unless they meet certain animal welfare standards. So these facilities in Arizona were in theory, among the more quote-unquote ethical approaches to producing laying hens because they were meeting California standards. Because the animals, as an example, they weren't in battery cages. Right, if your listeners are familiar, the battery cage is like the size of an 8.5 sheet of paper is the amount of space that the bird has. So this place in Arizona, they had more. It was called an enriched colony cage, so they had more space. The birds had a little more space. They had a perch, I think, in their slightly less small cage.
Still pretty crappy.
So yeah, it's still, and yet still you had the live maceration. So, and then in North Carolina, you have rural communities living next to these swine operations. And, these aren't the Hamptons. These are communities that in many cases don't have the political power to fight one of these operations from being built in their backyard, and often don't have the financial means to relocate, right? I mean, there's a reason why, there's likely a reason, it's hard to attribute intention on the part of the producers. I don't know why they do it.
Well, they're not putting them in the Hamptons.
Yeah, they're not putting them in the Hamptons. Let's just say that. They're putting them in places where communities are, in many cases, disadvantaged or unable to stop it.
Yeah.
And that's where they're ending up. And we hear from people who they can't go outside, they can't hang their laundry. And I'm quoting someone here because when you go outside and you take a whiff, you feel like you're going to throw up because the odors from these swine operations can be quite intense. It's unpleasant, and it's also a known health risk to live near one of these.
And that's the thing. I mean, there's so much that is like legal that's hurting people, hurting climate, hurting the planet. You guys got a lot on your plate, and I know you're not like here to solve it all, but you kind of are on some level, like to come up with a lot of solutions, right? In terms of your research and so give me some solutions to all of this.
Yeah, I wish we had more. It does feel like whack-a-mole sometimes. I would never claim to have all the answers. And I would certainly never say that the answers are easy because these are nuanced problems. I don't believe that there are necessarily villains in this story. I've met with a lot of farmers and had some, sometimes difficult conversations with these producers who will tell me, look, I'm a poultry grower on the Eastern Shore. I'm doing the best I can under the rules that were laid out for me. This is the game, and I'm playing the game. I'm the third, fourth generation poultry grower, and this is how the system works right now. And these farmers are in many cases, depending on the species, they take on a lot of debt. They incur debt to build these operations, and once you're in it, you don't even necessarily own the animals. You're almost like a serf in a fiefdom, and it's not easy to get out. So I guess I just preface this by saying, like, when we're talking about problems and solutions, I don't usually like place blame on the farmer as an example.
Well, no, I wouldn't place blame on the farmer either, but there's people above the farmer that aren't so kosher. I mean, and then we have so few people running the show in terms of industrial animal agriculture. It's so few companies who are doing most of it and trying to put labels on things like climate-friendly beef.
Certainly.
Like, they're definitely not innocent in any of this. But we're not going to go into that because we could talk about that for a long time.
I hear what you're saying.
But like, there are some villains. I'm sorry, but there are. But not the farmer, like the farmers who are kind of stuck in this indentured servitude, pretty much.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. I mean, one obvious thing would be, as a country and some other countries too, but we're probably the number one, I would think, the U.S., is that we just have to reduce our meat consumption.
Certainly.
But that's really easy to say. But how does that happen?
Yeah, so there are a couple ways that can happen. So I like the idea of changing food procurement. So working with large institutions. We have these food service providers like Aramark or Sodexo or Bon Appetit. Like, many of them are leading the way on this front. They're supplying food to thousands of universities, cafeterias around the country, right? If you can reach one of those food service providers, and again, many of them are already doing this, if they can set goals to change their sourcing practices to, for example, cut back on the amount of ruminant meat that they're serving and offer more plant-forward options, that's a powerful way to change what we call people's food environment in ways that make it easier for them to make the sustainable choice. Because certainly we can, and we need to educate people. And I hate to, it sounds patronizing when I say that. It's not that we have all the answers, but we want people to be informed about the impact of what they're eating in a very non-judgmental way, just meeting people where they're at, right? We want people to make informed choices, and their freedom to choose what they want. That's certainly an important piece of the puzzle, but we're reaching individuals. And I know you know, right? We don't make our food choices in a vacuum. We make them within the context of our culture, our taste preferences, what we can afford, what we can't afford, the people around us. We're more likely to eat like our peers, our family, right? And then thinking bigger than that, there's the policies that affect the prices of what different foods cost. The point being, like, we don't make food choices in a vacuum. So I like to think of it as, like, what can we do at a societal level to make the more sustainable choice the easier choice for people? The government is a massive buyer of food.
Yeah.
And if they make even just one small change, that has an enormous ripple effect. And surprisingly, many branches of the military are leading the way on this front.
Really?
It was a very pleasant surprise. Like, you think of, these are stereotypes, but you think, like meat and potatoes.
Yeah.
Right. That's,
For sure.
I think more than anyone, the military is aware of the implications of climate change because of the effects. If you have a military based on an island, you need to be prepared for that. So they are very savvy about what climate change means. And many of them are, these top military brass, are saying, hey, we swapped in tons of plant forward options. Again, we're not talking about like a vegan military force or anything like that, but, giving people more options.
One thing that we've learned, or we know, right, is like New York City, the 7 major hospitals have all gone plant-based by default. And it's been a year.
Mm-hmm.
And 70% of people eat the plant-based, which is healthy, right? You're in the hospital. It's a pretty good idea. Yeah. But it's just people eat what they're given. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of human. And so what you're saying, like, if this was done on huge scale levels, like military, a lot of people don't mind it. They think they're going to. If you told them it, they would mind. Like, we're going to give you vegan lunch. But they really don't when these companies do like plant-based by default type things. So that's very exciting about the military.
Yeah, I agree. It is exciting. And right. And we've heard, there have been interviews done with people. Prisons are another example where you have incarcerated persons who maybe for cultural or religious reasons are very happy to now have more options that align with their values or their faith. And it's not about taking options away from people. The meat options are still there. But maybe as an example, again, just kind of like you said, like leveraging the food environment and psychology, right? If you put the plant-based option up front in the buffet and someone puts that on their plate first and the meat option is a little further in the back. Right? I mean, supermarkets do this all the time for arguably more nefarious reasons, right? The sort of shelving, like why is the candy at the eye level of kids at the checkout, right?
Exactly.
Those same principles can be leveraged for good, as opposed to promoting obesity and diet-related disease by putting candy in, for kids to eat.
For sure. That's a exciting thing to think about, like a way to go forward.
Yes, it does give me hope. Yeah. It's exciting to see leaders, people leading the charge on that front. How that might change now, I don't know. Yeah. But that's a TBD.
But I do think the more corporations and companies and like LinkedIn is now plant-based by default, so their cafeterias and everything and their corporate offices
no kidding
are plant-based by default.
How about
Meaning
that?
Most of the food out is plants and people eat them. And that's happening more and more in the corporate world because I think the government stuff's going to get really tricky for a while. And so, I mean, that's so we have to think about that, though. I think, right?
Yeah. It's certainly better than saying, "Oh, well, we're powerless now.
Now we're screwed."
Yeah. Like let's find the areas. I mean, that's what we do. Like we try and identify those leverage points. Where can we make the most change? In the places where we can, and accept the places where maybe for a little while maybe we don't have as much power, but there's still a lot we can do.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
Well, Brent, thank you.
My pleasure.
To learn more about Brent and to learn about the Center for a Livable Future, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. The Center for a Livable Future also has a podcast. It's called Unconfined. They take deep dives into our food system. We will also have links to it on our website. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find this show. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knutson, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polkey-Link, Bethany Jones, Sierra Dolan, and Anna Kollner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.